There's a story that Swamiji often told. It's a traditional symbolic tale from India, and I've heard it many times. And today it seems to have a particular meaning to our subject. The story is told about Narada, who was the angel of the Lord. In the Indian tales, whenever God wants to send a messenger from the earth, a messenger to the earth, it's always Narada, who's quite willing and somehow manages always to make enough mistakes that it gives God the chance to correct it when he goes back and converses with Vishnu or whatever image of God is part of the story. So God sends Narada down to earth, and he gives him the assignment of finding the best devotees on the globe. So Narada travels and has lots of adventures, and eventually he meets this old ascetic man who's been living alone in a cave for 60 years, and he exists only on nettles, and he hardly sleeps at night, and he just has a rock where he rests himself just a little bit, and he does all these intense austerities, and Narada is very impressed and makes a note in his notebook. And then he's wandering around and he hears someone talking to God, but in a very actually inebriated voice and in an extremely disrespectful way. And he sees this young man who has imbibed too much and is not quite sober, and he's trying to build a fence, but because he's not functioning very well, he's having trouble getting the pole into the hole. And the whole time he's doing it, he's saying, "Lord, where are you when I need you? Now I'm having all this trouble. We need to get this post in. Where are you, Lord?" Like this. And Narada's amused, and he takes note also. So then he goes back and he reports to the Lord, and he gives the long list with special emphasis to this 60-year ascetic and how powerful he's been. And then just as an afterthought, when they're having tea after the formal report is over, Narada says, "And when, by the way, I met this foolish, drunken man." Now, something had happened when Narada mentioned the ascetic, that the Lord said, "Odd, I don't know him." And Narada said, "How could you not know him? He's devoted all his life to you." The Lord said, "Odd, I can't remember him." And then later, when Narada's talking about the drunk, the Lord said, "Oh yes, that fellow, I know him well." Narada is completely confused. He said, "Lord, this is an inebriated young man, and the other has given his life to you." The Lord said, "Well, go back," he said, "and take to each of them the same message." And that message is, "I'm busy right now passing 1,000 camels through the eye of a needle. But as soon as I'm done, I'll come to see you." So this is a little confusing to Narada, but the Lord is in charge, and he goes to the ascetic, and he tells him, "The Lord has a message for you." The ascetic is really ready to hear it. He said, right now he's busy passing 1,000 camels through the eye of a needle, but as soon as he's done, he's going to come to you. And the ascetic gets very stern and then very angry. He said, "Passing camels through the eye of a needle, what a useless preoccupation, and I have to wait until he's done?" He said, "I've wasted 60 years on God and his foolish crowd." He said, "I'm going to go get what I can while I still can." And he leaves the cave, goes back to the world. Then he goes to the drunk and he says, "The Lord is passing the camels through the eye of the needle, but then he'll come." And all of a sudden the drunk becomes so excited and ecstatic. And Narada is completely bewildered. And he said, "Passing camels through the eye of a needle is the work of but an instant for the Lord." He said, "He's coming even now." And of course, the lesson is obvious, that it isn't what you appear to be, it's what you have in your heart. Now, this is our story today about the virgins and the lamps, that all of them are walking around looking like they're doing the same thing. But they're not all doing the same thing, and that becomes true when God himself comes. I mean, these are images. And the image of the bride and the bridegroom is one that is often used in spiritual stories. And it's used in spiritual stories not because some people imagine that they're trying to elevate the erotic element of life, not at all. But what they're trying to represent is that in that kind of love that you think of between a bride and a bridegroom, what you have is great closeness. You have great intimacy. That's a word that we use a lot when we're trying to talk about how we really want to relate to each other when all of the barriers are taken down. That the relationship is as close. And it's even described in that Bible story that when the bridegroom came, he took each of his brides into the room and the door was closed. And when the foolish virgins came back, the door was closed against them. In other words, that there was the privacy of the moment and the deepest possible intimacy that could only happen heart to heart in that moment. Now, recently, I've been reading a beautiful book about Ananda Sangha. It's by Batika Mukherjee. It's not easily available. It costs a fortune. It's a cheap Indian book, but to get it in America, it costs you about $30. It's worth every dollar, I promise you. And Ananda Sangha was a great saint of India. She died in 1982. Swami Kriyananda was particularly close to her. When he spent 4 years in India, he became very, well, intimate is the word. He became very close with Ananda Sangha. As he described it, when he was with his own guru, Yogananda, Swami Kriyananda was 22 years old. Yogananda was in the last years of his life. And Swamiji, as he put it, said he was always in such awe of Master that he was never able to really just fully relax and embrace him because he was just a young devotee and he never was able to come to that level of comfort. And then in 1958, when he went to India after he'd been on the path for 10 years, and he met Ananda Sangha, who also was a woman saint of divine stature, he had the maturity, as he put it, within himself to understand more deeply how properly to relate. And he was able to have with her, he said, the kind of outwardly close and inwardly close relationship that he never was able to have with Master. It was like a gift to him afterwards. He never shifted his loyalty, but he was able to express his devotion more. Now, Ananda Sangha tells this story, which is so touching. People began to call her Ma. She was a great saint from when she was a young woman, and it took people time to realize who she was, and gradually they began to call her Mother and Ma, and that became her name. Joy-permeated Mother is what Ananda Sangha means. Well, one of the devotees was talking, and this was just when they were beginning to call her Mother, and they were asking her, one of the women was asking her, you know, can we call you Mother? May we call you Mother? Will you be our Mother? And her answer was so deep and so touching, and I must say, so reminiscent of the way Swamiji responds, that reading this book, I understood much more deeply why they were so close. She said, well, it's fitting in a way that I should be your mother. She said, but the mother is always held at a little bit of a distance, not far, but because of the respect you hold for your mother. She said, I would rather be your child. She said, make a place for me in your heart the way you would make a place for your own child. She said, then I will always be with you. Now, this is Christmas, and this is the time when we have the baby Jesus, when we all become bhakti yogis, we all become devotees who move by the heart. Because what we have in front of us is this beautiful image of this baby. And you have the Mother Mary cradling the baby, and you have all these stories of the angel bringing the baby, and we bring it down to a child's level where the angels come and the kings come on Christmas morning. For those of you who can possibly be here, we celebrate the story with the enthusiasm of a 6-year-old. We just go back every time and do it because it makes a place in our heart for the baby Jesus, you see, and then we're never separated. So Ananda Sangha is there. She's radiating the greatness of the divine in every way. And she says, don't call me mother, that's not enough. Think about how parents feel about their children. I mean, the mother literally brings the baby out of her own body. She holds the baby under her heart, as mothers often say, for those 9 months. The father bears responsibility for the raising and the protection of this child. There's no effort required to remember. It's impossible to take that child out of your heart. I'm amused in a very poignant way, because I am of an age now where all the little babies that used to be the children of my peers are now grown up, and now they have grandbabies, and my baby is now 55 years old or 60 years old. I have no children of my own, but this is what my friends say. And yet, I'm so amused. That child still lives in the heart of its mother and still lives in the heart of its father. And no matter how much of a big hulk that child has become, to the parent, it's always that place in the heart. Now, Swamiji tells us in a way that's most marvelous and slightly mystifying that absolutely everything that happens in this world is only a symbol of a greater reality. That's not an easy thought to grasp, because the greater reality seems subtle and a little bit elusive. And the world that we're living in, we can hold it in our hands, we can bump up against it, we can relate to it in a very accessible, concrete way. So no matter how deep our philosophy, depending on our state of realization, we feel like this is the primary world and that is there somewhere, and we touch it sometimes, but we don't primarily live in that. So to be told that everything here that seems so solid is only symbolic of that greater reality, you have to stretch your mind to get there. That's why Swamiji said it, of course, because he's always trying to stretch our minds, trying to break us out of these little envelopes in which we have sealed ourselves. But all of our human experiences are there to teach us about eternal divinity. So what is more compelling for people than the family tie, the desire for the mate, the power of the bride and the bridegroom who cannot be kept apart, then the love of the parents for their children, and on like this. But all of this is symbolic of the real source, the real way to fulfillment, the real desire for which this is merely a facade. So we understand what it is, whether we've experienced it or we just know what it is to love a child. And then Ananda Ma says, that's how you should love me. And when she says me, she's speaking of herself as guru, and she's also speaking of herself as a pure window for the divine. That's how you should love me. Make a place in your heart that is so intimate that no effort is required to go there. There's the story also told of Draupadi, who was the wife of Arjuna and the other Pandavas. And this is in the story from the Mahabharata, which the Bhagavad Gita is from that. And Draupadi was a great devotee of Krishna. And Krishna came to her at one point and suggested to her that perhaps she should practice yoga. Now, yoga in this is not yoga postures, but yoga is the science of God realization. Maybe she would like to learn how to meditate, how to concentrate, how to use these techniques in order to focus your attention and get deeper into your awareness of God. And her response was, "Oh Lord, I would practice yoga eagerly if I could take my mind away from you long enough to be able to learn it." You see, because the love was so strong that even the techniques meant nothing anymore. It simply falls away. Everything, and this is the ascetic, they are doing all these practices. There's another story from this book that I've been reading. I don't want to just dwell on making a book review here, but that Anandamayi Ma moved all over India all the time. She was always just traveling. She had what they called her, there's a Sanskrit word for it that just means the inner call. She just moved according to her inner call, and it was completely chaotic around her at all times because she would just get up in the night and go somewhere. And she would just walk out of the ashram. And when people would talk about it, she said, but I'm always the same. I'm always in the same place, meaning she was always in the same state of consciousness. She said, when you move from room to room, you don't make such a big deal about it, do you? And that was the way she would walk all over the country. But she went to this place, and there was a woman there who was also very austere, and as sometimes happens, especially this was in the 1930s, this was, not quite 100 years ago. And she was living in a very austere life in a little hut, and she had been widowed at a young age, and as it turned out, although no one knew this, her daughter had died at the age of 20. And after all of that, she went to just live austerely in this place. And she was very much admired by all the local people because of the rigidity and of her austerities and the simplicity of her life. Well, Anandamayi Ma was called to go to that area, probably for her sake, for the sake of this woman. And the woman, for some reason, saw in Anandamayi Ma a reflection of her own daughter. And so she was relating to Ma in a very close way. And then, let me just get this story exactly right. At one point, Anandamayi Ma sort of spoke to her about the fact that this ascetic woman was relating to her as if she was her child. And so then Ma said, if I'm going to be your child, that means I will call you as my mother. And then Ma began to cry out, Ma, 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 but in such a way that she was evoking in the ascetic woman the whole experience of having raised and given birth to that woman, the child, and then lost her. And all of a sudden, the entire facade of austerity and peace that this ascetic woman had been holding completely disintegrated. And all of the broken-hearted reality of her life was just poured out at Ma's feet. And some of the people around her said, Ma, how have you served her? She had her life. She was strong. She was forceful in what she was doing. And now you have disintegrated her peace. And Ma said, it serves us nothing to try to bury or to hide our feelings. She said, God is within us and He knows. Now, coming back to Ma saying, make that place in your heart, and the foolish virgins whom the bridegroom rejected. You see, it doesn't make any difference what we look like. It doesn't even make any difference what we think. It doesn't make any difference what we think about ourselves, what anybody else thinks about us. The only thing that matters is behind closed doors, when there is nobody present but ourself and the divine, that we are intimate with God. Master put it this way, you must individually make love to God, is what he said. No one can do it for you. And no ritual, no outer way of doing it, no getting yourself organized in the best possible way is going to make any difference to that. In the last years of his life, in so many ways, Swami Kriyananda's personality completely shifted. It was a little hard to track sometimes because things happen gradually. Just as we're talking so much about children, children grow up step by step, and it's only when you see the Christmas card every year that you realize how big they've gotten. And so Swamiji shifted a little at a time, and he shifted over, it was reflected in geography. When he was in America, for the first so many years that we knew him, several decades, he was always trying to relate to the American consciousness. And he did a great deal of serious teaching. And those are just fabulous classes. There's hundreds of them, and they're all archived, and Treasures Along the Path will give you all those talks. And he taught every conceivable subject on the spiritual path with this enormous intellectual force. And he wasn't teaching intellectually, but this enormous intellect in which he explained and made it powerful and all these different things. And whenever he would talk about Yogananda, he would often say, Yogananda, Paramhansa Yogananda, you can listen to it. Then in the late 90s, he moved to Italy. And in Italy, there's just much more heart. When Swamiji would sometimes be here and give satsang, sometimes he would greet people afterwards. And this being such an international area, there would be many different cultures. I say here because he would sit here and people would walk like that. Many different cultures would be represented. Swami speaks 8 different languages, and so sometimes when he would recognize the language, he would begin to speak. And often we would stand right next to him in order to help, because he didn't always hear well, or to introduce people. So the Americans would come and they would say, oh, Swamiji, I'm so glad that you came. It's really been an honor to see you. Oh, yes, he would say, it's really nice to be here. And there would be a very warm exchange, but just slightly formal. Then the Italians would come in, and I don't speak Italian, but just a little bit. I mean, I can understand a little. And what would happen is they would say, ha, 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 and Swami would say, ha, 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 ha. And there would just be almost no content. I mean, I could tell enough Italian to tell there was no content. There was just this wave of love coming to him and this wave of love going back. It wasn't that he didn't love Americans at all. It's just he loved Americans like to be loved. I'm very glad that you came. How nice that you could be here. So when he went to Italy, he started talking about master. That was the word he would use. He rarely referred to Yogananda as Yogananda. He would always call him master, which is how the disciple calls him. And then, in 2003, he moved to India. And of course, he's moving into the end of his life. And as he put it, in America you can give something, in Italy you can give more, in India you can give everything. It's not merely that they have a background in these teachings, it's that God lives more in the heart there. They understand this, they just know. And then he started calling Master my Guru. And he rarely used any other phrase. He would just say, my Guru. And as the years passed and he got closer and closer to the end of his life, oh dear, he could hardly say that without crying. Just those words. He would just get as far as my Guru. And then he would have to just stop. Because that was all that was needed. You know? That's where we're going. And let's not stop until we get